Yes.
Professor Ludlam, before we turn in more detail to what happened in Edinburgh in relation to AIDS, I just want to ask you about some elements of national decision-making, first of all, and information sharing. Shomik, could we have on screen, please, PRSE 40372? You'll see here, Professor Ludlam, this is a Council of Europe recommendation from June of 1983. And if we go to the second page, and we zoom in on the top, thank you, we can see that the Council of Europe's recommendation is to governments of member states to take all necessary steps and measures with respect to AIDS, and in particular to avoid wherever possible the use of coagulation factor products prepared from large plasma pools, especially important for those countries where self-sufficiency has not yet been achieved, to inform attending physicians and selected recipients such as haemophiliacs of the potential health hazards of haemotherapy and the possibilities of minimising these risks, and then to provide all blood donors with information on AIDS. Now, as I understand it from a later document, you were not aware of this at the time. Is that right?
That's correct. I think the first time I saw it was in connection with the Penrose report. I don't recall ever seeing it or ever finding it in when I look back through my records of minutes and other documents.
It may have been slightly earlier than that. I don't think we need to go to it, but there's an exchange of correspondence that you had with an MSP, Ms. Leckie, in 2005, in which you said the existence of the recommendation was not known to me, nor was it discussed at any of the meetings I attended.
I'm sure that's correct, yes.
So, would you agree that this is a piece of information that should have been brought to the attention of at the very least, the UK HCGO's reference centre directors so that they could reflect on its significance?
Entirely. I don't understand why it never reached us.
At this time in 1983, 1984, to what extent was there interactions between either UK HCGO and the Chief Medical Officer in England, or the Chief Medical Officers in relation to Wales or Scotland?
In England, the Department of Health had a representative at the reference centre directors' meetings, and they acted as a conduit for bringing information from the Department of Health and for relaying to the Department of Health views that have been discussed and decisions taken at the reference centre director meetings. As far as Scotland was concerned, I'm sorry, can you repeat your question? Was it?
Yes, I was wondering whether the Chief Medical Officers in Scotland had any involvement with representatives of haemophilia centres in Scotland to discuss issues relating to AIDS in 83 or 84?
No, the discussions that did take place were the discussions that had been minuted, and I think we've mostly talked about. There were some later on in 1984 that we perhaps come to later. But the Scottish Home and Health Department took the lead in bringing together, as I mentioned yesterday, haemophilia doctors and blood transfusion in Scotland in the early 80s, and they were kept in touch with these sort of matters that way. I think there would probably also have been communication between the Department of Health for England and the Scottish Home and Health Department. There was a conduit of information travelling up and down that route as well. Sorry, I can't speak for Wales or Northern Ireland.
So in relation to the Council of Europe recommendation, it would seem to follow from your evidence that the obvious conduit for providing that information to Haemophilia Centre directors would have been through the Department of Health's attendance at the reference centre directors' meetings?
Yes.
Can we then look at another letter from 1983? This is the letter from Dr. Galbraith. It's CBLA 5043_040. Please, Shomek. And we've looked at this within the inquiry before. It's Dr. Galbraith's letter of the 9th of May 1983, addressed to Dr. Field at the Department of Health. He draws attention to the case of AIDS in haemophiliac in Cardiff, to a report of 3 cases in the Lancet of AIDS in haemophiliacs in Spain, and an update on cases in the US. And then he sets out his recommendation that blood products made from blood donated in the USA after 1978 should be withdrawn, and there's a paper which sets out the reasons. The evidence that you provided to the Penrose inquiry indicates that this was a document that you did not see at the time. Is that right?
That's correct, yes.
Would you agree that it's a document that should have been brought to the attention of reference centre directors?
I believe it would have been very helpful if it had been brought. I note it's written on the 9th of May, which is a very significant date. And I suppose I've wondered why it wasn't written before the 9th of May. Dr. Galbraith worked in CDSC in Colindale, part of the PHLS. He would have received MMWR weekly reports. It'd be his bread and butter, much like the Financial Times is for a stockbroker. So he would have seen the cases of AIDS back in 1982, and he would know about non-A, non-B hepatitis. That was a general public health issue in his field, and so he would know, I assume, about importation of blood products in that context, and I would have thought, would have been alert to the fact that the haemophiliacs reported in from CDC in July and December being treated with concentrates, and for all the reasons we were discussing before coffee. He might well have thought that the infectious agent could travel in could be found in concentrates, and should the consideration about stopping their importation have been made much earlier. But that, if you like, is with the benefit of some hindsight.
You suggested in one of the documents you provided to the Penrose inquiry that you thought Dr. Galbraith might be wrong in stating that the case at that time in the UK was a Cardiff case. Do you want me to show you that, or do you recall that?
I'm quite prepared to talk about the Cardiff case because I think it the way it has been documented and portrayed, I think, from my perspective anyway, I've done a little research into it, and I think the way things rolled out in relation to this case are not quite as they might seem.
Well,
if I can put it that way.
Professor Ludlam, my questions to you about the Cardiff case are going to be based upon what you did or didn't know at the time, rather than anything subsequently, because we do have information that you may not have in relation to the individual case itself. But if we look at PRSE 40353, please, Shomek. Just to give us an idea of timing, and it may explain the timing of Dr. Galbraith's letter, this is the Communicable Disease Surveillance Centre's weekly report, and you'll see under the heading Acquired Immune Deficiency Syndrome Cardiff, there for the week ending the 6th of May is a report of a case of AIDS in a patient with haemophilia in the United Kingdom. And no doubt that's the basis for Dr. Galbraith's letter. What I wanted to ask you, Professor Ludlam, is this. What did Professor Bloom say, if anything, about the Cardiff case at the time to you or your fellow reference centre directors?
I'm sorry, I can't remember him describing to me or at a meeting about the details of his case. I'm sorry, I have no memory of that.
Do you recall whether he and if so when, he informed you and your reference centre director colleagues of the fact of there being a case of a patient under his care?
Well, I think this diagnosis, if I can put it that way, definitive diagnosis, was made by Dr. Galbraith, I think, rather than Professor Bloom. I'm happy to go into my reasons for thinking that, if it would be helpful, and to what Professor Bloom said or knew about it.
I think what we'd be interested in, Professor Ludlam, subject to any questions that the Chair himself might wish to ask you, is what was said or known at the time. In May of 1983, there is reported the case of a patient in Cardiff with AIDS, or fulfilling the criteria for AIDS. Was that something that was discussed amongst reference centre directors in May of 1983 or thereabouts, is my question.
I don't recall it being discussed in a meeting in around that time of May.
Okay.
Although Professor Bloom had told the Haemophilia Society annual general meeting at the end of April that he may have a mild case of AIDS. So he was aware that he might have a case of AIDS.
Want to move forward to, again, before we come back to more detail to specifically to Edinburgh, to the meeting that took place in December 1984, 10th of December at Elstree, and the production of the AIDS advisory document that followed. Now, if we look at the minutes of the meeting on the 10th of December, HCDO 40394_117. Now, With the exception of Dr. Preston, you're the first attendee at the meeting to give evidence on this. So I just wanted to ask you, and indeed maybe the only attendee or one of few attendees who give evidence. So I just wanted to ask you, first of all, what your recollections are of how this meeting came about. Because the Reference Centre directors had their regular meeting in I think it was September of that year. How did this meeting come about?
I think there are a number of factors. One was the knowledge, or rather the reports, that HTLV3 was heat sensitive from Jay Levy's work and from the Cutter work in October of 1984. There had been a death of a further patient with AIDS, a patient with haemophilia in the UK. And I think one of the factors was my discovering that some NHS, a batch of factory NHS had infected a group of patients in Edinburgh. I think this was the first definitive evidence that the UK blood supply was in fact contaminated or had resulted in an infection of patients. So I think there are a number of reasons for holding this meeting.
If we could just go down the page, please, Shomek. We can see at item 1, the introduction to the meeting, the way it's put by Professor Bloom, the chairman outlined that the resulting publicity surrounding the events in Newcastle and Australia and the continuing work on HTLV3 has precipitated today's meeting. So the continuing work on HTLV3 may be the issue to which you've referred a few moments ago. What can you recall about publicity surrounding events in Newcastle and Australia, if anything?
I'm sorry, I have no recollection. I could speculate about Australia, but that might not be helpful.
I'm not going to go through the detail of the minutes with you, Professor Ludlam, but if we go to page 5, please, Shomek. Sorry, can we pick it up page 4 first of all? I want to ask you about the discussion that took place on the question of whether or not to inform patients of their test results. So if we see under the heading Advice to Patients and Donors, there are interventions from or recorded from Dr. Jones, and then it says a long discussion took place on whether persons found to be positive were to be informed. Several different views were expressed. It was agreed that each clinician would decide for each case depending on the facts of the case, but in general to provide information if asked for. And then if we go to the next page, top half of the page, we can see, if we look 4th paragraph down, there's a comment from Dr. Kernoff as some 70% of haemophiliacs are now positive. It may be considered irrelevant if one tells or doesn't tell the results of testing. The chairman summarised by saying that testing should be instituted as soon as possible and that information on the test results should not be given automatically, but if asked for. As I say, we'll come on to your own practice in Edinburgh in a few minutes, but what, if anything, can you recall about the discussion on the testing of the telling of patients of their test results?
I'm sorry, I can't. I used to have a good memory of this meeting because it was an important and it was a traumatic meeting, and it was stressful. And I had because of that, I had a good memory. I'm sorry, I can remember one or two things from the meeting, but my memory has faded, and so I would be speculating as to what was discussed.
If we go to the last page, the paragraph towards the bottom of the page under the heading advisory statements, it says recommendations would be issued on the day's proceedings. These would be widely circulated. And then there's a suggestion that made by Dr. Lane that haemophilia directors be allowed to have a private meeting with only themselves present. And we don't have a UK HCDO minute of this meeting. This is Mr. Pettit of BPL's note. Do you recall anything about why there was a private meeting and what the content of that private meeting was?
I wish I could help you. I've never seen any record. It rather surprises me if we did have a meeting. So I'm sorry, I can't help you. I have no record of that.
We'll see there the paragraph above that refers to recommendations being issued. These would be widely circulated. And we know that that became the AIDS advisory document. If we look at the final version of it, first of all, HCDO 40/270_007, please, Shomik. We can see, and again, I'm not going to go through the detail of it, but we can see this is the final version. If we go to the last page, please. Just wanted to draw your attention to two matters. The first is, under the heading antibody testing, the third paragraph says, AB positive people should be informed, reassured and counselled regarding transmission to spouses, etc., including the possible use of barrier contraception. So it would appear that following a discussion at which it was more equivocal as to whether patients should be told their test results, according to Mr. Pettit's note, the final recommendation is that patients should be informed. Do you have any recollection of any further decision-making or discussion about the formulation of this final recommendation?
No, it's as seen.
Okay. And then if we look just at the very bottom of the page, just want to draw your attention to the date. So we can see that this final document is dated the 14th of December. I'm going to try and ask for your assistance as to when it might actually have been finalised and shared with other directors who weren't present. It may be relevant for later clinicians, Professor Ludlam, to understand how and when this document was sent out. So could we look, please, Shomik, at HCDO 40/273_052. So we can see that this is a letter to you from Professor Bloom dated the 18th of December, saying, I'm enclosing my version of the discussions last Monday the 10th. I plan to send out the document or something like this to Haemophilia Centre directors. Would be grateful for your comments as soon as possible. I understand that articles in newspapers are due. The Lancet editorial should be out by the 29th of December. If you have any comments, please let me know by letter or telephone as soon as possible. So we can see here Professor Bloom sending you on the 18th of December what would appear to be a draft of the document we've just looked at in final form. If we go to HCDO 40/273_053, please. This is appears to be the document that was sent to you. It's also dated the 14th of December 1984, so the same date as the final version. Am I right in thinking, please tell me if I'm not, if we go to the second half of this page, the handwritten notes are yours?
It looks like my writing. I'm having difficulty, as I sometimes do, in reading my own writing.
And if we just look at the very bottom of the page, you'll see it says, last paragraph, it seems probable that HTLV3 has been incorporated into at least one BPL and one Scottish batch of factor VIII. recipients have been informed and are being followed up. Someone's written, reference to recipients have been informed, no. And of course, we know that recipients hadn't been informed. I'm going to explore that with you in a moment, Professor. And the final version takes out the reference to recipients have been informed. So it would seem likely that that's you making the correction because you know that your patients haven't yet been informed.
Yes, it's possible I wrote no. It doesn't look quite like the way I would write now. I don't know whether someone else has looked at this.
Okay.
I'm sorry. I might have written that on the 18th. Have been informed. No, that's probably. I might have written that.
Do you know? Maybe at this distance of time you can't help, but do you know whether you sent this back in the post to Professor Bloom or you telephoned Professor Bloom?
This was December 1984.
Yes, so the letter to you was the 18th of December 1984 and presumably would not have been received by you until the 19th, the earliest.
Well, it is Christmas as well, the Christmas post.
Yes, yeah. I'm sorry. I think it likely I'll have received it before Christmas. It was if it's dated the 18th, it must have been perhaps hit the mail on the 19th. I might have received it on the 20th or the 21st. Or I don't know whether it was a weekend in the middle, or I probably have seen it before Christmas.
The other aspect is perhaps this. If we just go back for a moment to 273052052 underscore 052, that is. And just curious, looking at the typeface, there is a different font size giving your address, Professor Ludlam. The date is in the larger font size, so also is the body of the text. It looks as though it was sent round to all the directors. Do we have other examples of this?
I don't know without checking, sir. We may do. This has been provided to us by UKHCDO.
Yes.
So there may be other examples.
So it may well be that all the directors who took part in the discussion got a letter like this saying that this is what I'm going to send round, and any comment.
Yes. Yes. I mean, you'll understand, sir, there are later witnesses to whom the question of when this document was finally received is highly relevant.
Yes.
Yes, I think that's a very astute observation. I wasn't the only recipient, I think, of this letter.
All right, well, it doesn't sound like you'll be able to assist us further about timings, which is perhaps unsurprising. Can I then come on to, first of all, the question of what patients in Edinburgh were told about AIDS, and then secondly, I want to come on to your discovery of the infection of a number of your patients in the autumn of 1984. If we look at your witness statement again, WITN 3428001, please, Seamus. And if we go to page 90, please. Paragraph 237, bottom of the page. You've said this: the view has been expressed by patients to the present inquiry that they should have been informed about the risk of AIDS from blood products in 1983 and 1984. Whilst I was aware from the Haemophilia Society that there was anxiety in UK patients expressing concern and seeking information, particularly about the use of imported concentrates, as I've recorded elsewhere, I do not recall such inquiries from patients in Edinburgh. I think this was probably because patients were being treated with local NHS-prepared therapy. Had I been asked by them, I would have explained the current information in relation to AIDS and indicated that it was possible that an infective agent might get into the blood supply, but that I considered the risk to be small. I would not have recommended any change of therapy. Professor Ludlam, this paragraph would suggest that you did not take any proactive steps to advise your patients in 1983 or 1984 of the risks, possible risks of AIDS from factor concentrates. Is that correct?
That, I think, is correct as best I can remember. I would have answered question, but I didn't, as it were, proactively raise the subject with patients.
And if we go to a document you prepared for the Penrose inquiry, it's PRSE 304704. You'll see it's headed information about HIV it's information about HIV available to patients and families, and then there's a subheading information about HIV for patients in Scotland prior to the 1st of December 1984. You've identified on this page a number of pieces of information which are all Haemophilia Society documents. You refer to 3 bulletins, an interview from Dr. Kernoff, reference to a talk given by Professor Bloom, an article by Ken Milne, and then the Haemofact May 1983 publication from Professor Bloom. And then you go on to discuss those in some more detail and refer to the Haemophilia Society documents in more detail over the pages. Can I ask you this? Did you read those publications at the time and conclude that they gave sufficient information to patients and that you therefore didn't need to say anything? Or is this document an ex post facto attempt to identify information patients might have seen?
This was, we regularly received from the Haemophilia Society their bulletins, and we made them available in the Haemophilia Centre, so patients could pick them up and take them home, or read them there. So that's how of course, some of the patients, or many of the patients, belonged to the Haemophilia Society, and we've got a copy through the post as a member.
You would accept, presumably, that there may have been patients who weren't members or who didn't read the bulletins?
Yes, there would be.
I'm not suggesting that you didn't make these documents available within the centre to be picked up if patients wanted to look at them. But did you look and see what was being said in them about HIV or about AIDS, HTLV3, and the risks to patients, and decide at the time that because the Haemophilia Society was passing information on, you didn't need to?
I have to say that I probably didn't read them because I had a pile of posts to deal with every morning, quite a large in tray, and there'll be a bundle of these, and I'd say to my secretary, oh, can you put these in the Haemophilia Centre, please? We'll give them to the system for patients, and I'd move on to the next item in the in tray.
Would you accept as a matter of principle that it's the professional responsibility of a clinician to give a patient information about the risks of treatment rather than relying upon what patients may or may not read or be told elsewhere?
Yes, I would agree, but it depends on the risk and what might whether one should take different action as a result of that risk.
Would you agree that the question of whether to take different action as a result of risk, so for example the decision not to continue receiving factor concentrates, is a decision for the patient, ultimately not the doctor, because it's their choice as to what magnitude of risk they are willing to run?
It comes down to a matter of what is the level of risk. It's always been accepted that clotting factor concentrates may transmit viruses or other infective agents. And there's a question as to at what level it's appropriate and to whom to make that risk known.
You may have thought, Professor, that the risk was a small one, but it was a risk, if it eventuated, of being infected with a very serious and likely fatal disease. Wasn't that highly relevant for the patient to know, again, to enable them to take a decision for themselves?
You raise a very interesting point about, if I can put it this way, the severity of HIV or HTLV-3 infection, because what wasn't at all clear at this stage was the severity of the consequences of HIV or HTLV-3 infection. That only became known gradually, but in 1986, 87, perhaps. There are virtually no other viral infections that cause almost 100% mortality. Most viral infections result in a spectrum of clinical presentations, and the degree of mortality is usually very low. And I'm a bit reluctant to talk about COVID because of all the great parallels there are between it and other epidemics. But with COVID, as we know, the mortality is somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 1,000, or even less, depending on a number of clinical factors. What wasn't appreciated at this stage in 1983 and 84 was that if you got infected, that you were almost certainly going to get severe clinical consequences.
Professor Ludlam, the documents we've looked at from 1983, and they're a snapshot at various points in time, so the figures change, but some of the ones we've looked at this morning show of the 10 haemophiliacs reported at a point of time in 1983, 50% had died. The mortality rate generally in relation to AIDS patients reported from the States is variously described by Dr. Krask. 40% is a figure given in some of his reports. The precise figure varies. But it was very clear, was it not, that this was a disease with a high mortality rate. Not necessarily a certainty of death, but a high mortality rate. Would you accept that?
I see where the confusion has arisen. There's a difference between being infected with a virus and developing AIDS. After you've been infected, I think we're agreed, with HIV, there's a long latent period before you get sufficient immune suppression, depression, for opportunistic infections to occur. And at that point, for example, when the patient gets pneumocystis, they have AIDS, and their life expectancy on average, after developing AIDS is short and is the 40% that you've been talking about. If we go back to the initial infection and the antibody positive results that we had in 1984, at that time, it was thought by many individuals, well-informed individuals, that the risk of developing AIDS, in other words, clinical consequences of HIV infection, was small, because at that stage, only between 1 in 100 and 1 in 500 people who were antibody positive had developed the clinical syndrome of AIDS, mostly with by demonstration, by presenting with PCP.
Given the high mortality rate of those who develop AIDS, was it not important that your patients should be given that information so they could take their own decisions, Professor?
Well, if the risk of them developing AIDS was only 1 in 100 or 1 in 500, that is a relatively small risk, considering the risks of bleeding and death from bleeding, which in the years we're considering, 1983 and 84, it seems there were possibly, by the end of 1983, 2 cases of AIDS in the UK. There were 5 times that number of deaths from bleeding, let alone all the other causes of morbidity and mortality. So I would put it in that context. It's a matter of relative risk. And one's doing that the whole time in thinking about these issues.
Could we look at your statement, WITN 3428001, please? And go to page 93. If we look at paragraph 245, you talk there about DDAVP, and you say you would explain to a patient about its potential side effects, which include nausea, flushing, and water retention. Do we correctly understand from that your practice in 83-84 would have been to explain to your patient that if they use DDAVP, they might get nausea, flushing, or water retention, but you wouldn't explain to them that factor concentrates might infect them with a virus for which there was no treatment and a high mortality rate?
Well, I have set out here the reactions that occur in virtually all patients, particularly if you give the desmopressin infusion quickly. So these, if you like, were common reactions. The other, in relation to HIV, were of a different frequency. I agree. The consequences of HIV infection, as we now know it, and I think this is one of the difficulties of trying to look back with hindsight, knowing what we know in 2020. I'm trying to do the best I can for you.
In August of 1983, so not in December of 2020, but in August of 1983, or very soon thereafter, you would have become aware that a patient in Bristol who was a haemophiliac died of AIDS. Is that information which you shared with your patients?
I don't remember doing that, no.
If we look, please, at NHBT 002066H, Shomik. You'll see, Professor Ludlam, this is a National Blood Transfusion Service letter with a leaflet, July 1983. We go to the next page, please. You may or may not have seen it at the time, you may well not have done. If we look towards the bottom of the page, we can see the question, go to the bottom, thanks. Can AIDS be transmitted by transfusion of blood and blood products? Almost certainly yes. There's only the most remote chance of this happening with ordinary blood transfusions, and then it goes on to talk about haemophiliacs, and it explains in the last sentence, should just one of the donors be suffering from AIDS, then the factor VIII could transmit the disease. So you'll see the approach taken by the Blood Transfusion Service in England in July of 1983, or perhaps a little later than that in terms of the dissemination of the leaflet, was donors, not themselves at risk, were to be told that almost certainly, yes, AIDS could be transmitted by the transfusion of blood products. But your patients as recipients of factor concentrates were not being given that information. Does that strike you as the correct outcome?
Looked at in retrospect and hearing what the patients are now saying, and if we had received the Council of Europe document, then maybe we should have explained this to patients. I think it was fairly well understood by patients that there was a risk. And I think that comes out in some of the statements that Scottish patients have given to the inquiry, that they thought the risk was small because of our self-sufficiency and so on.
Can I move then to the testing of patients for HTLV3 in the autumn of 1984? First of all, as I understand the evidence that you gave Penrose and that you provided to this inquiry, in the autumn of 1984, you used stored samples without patient consent and without telling your patients to test or to have tested by Dr. Tedder for AIDS, for HTLV3, sorry. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes.
In relation to the stored samples, for how long had a library or bank of samples been built up at the Edinburgh Centre?
It was standard practice going back into the 1970s that virology department, if you sent a sample to them, they did the investigations and they then stored the sample in a long-term store in a deep freeze. That was their standard practice. That was good practice, and one supported by various authorities. We started collecting them in the haematology department in parallel because one weekend in the early 1980s, a deep freeze failed, and all the samples melted and were lost. And so we kept a sample, a parallel sample, as it were, as a backup to virology. But virology continued to collect least to store samples that we sent for routine testing for hepatitis or other investigations. That was part of their standard arrangements.
And when did the centre's own practice triggered, as you've described, by a deep freeze failing, and when did that commence?
I think it might have been about 1982, perhaps. I forget exactly when, but I remember that there had been this failure of the equipment in virology.
If we look at PRSE 40828, so I'm turning now to your interactions with Dr. Tedder, Professor. This is a memo. It's between Dr. McClelland and Dr. Perry, CC to Dr. Cash, 20th of November, but it may help us give some dates. It tells us in paragraph 1 that on the 26th of October, you telephoned Dr. McClelland at home to tell him that 6 haemophiliac patients had developed antibody to HTLV3. And then we can see in paragraph 4, on the 2nd of November, so the following Friday, you telephoned Dr. McClelland to explain that you'd received further data from Dr. Tedder relating to a total of 16 of his haemophilia patients. Is this likely to be a reliable guide to the dates?
I think so, yes.
As far as you can recall, how many samples did you first send off to Dr. Tedder?
My recollection was sending about 10 samples. My recollection also is that Dr. Tedder had a slightly different memory when he provided evidence to the Penrose inquiry. I don't think it was a major difference in numbers, but it was a small number.
And your evidence to the Penrose inquiry suggested there was an initial batch and then a follow-up larger batch.
That's correct, yes.
I'm going to ask you to look at something Dr. Tedder said to the Lindsay Tribunal. It's LIND 40310, please. And if we go to page 13, we can pick it up at the bottom of the page. The last few lines, Dr. Tedder is discussing, in late autumn 84, we did the first testing for him, and he refers to going through this litany of positive, 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 and Christopher Ludlam obviously getting more and more pensive, and me feeling over the page. Top 4 lines, less and less kind as this evolution of damage done to a cohort evolved. That was the very early testing that he'd sent us cohorts of samples, which he already had a clinical suspicion that something had occurred, and that was the beginning of the evolution of knowledge on the Edinburgh cohort. And so Dr. Tedder's recollection was that you had a clinical suspicion that something had occurred. Is that correct?
No, I had no clinical suspicion. No, I had no clinical suspicion. I notice on the previous page, reference is made to the glandular fever episode, which he puts as, I think, 1985. I don't know if you can go back a page.
Let's go back to the bottom of the previous page, Mick.
I'm sorry. I'm not quite sure what's up on the screen at the moment. When did this first come to light? This outbreak was of the Scottish product. I think you give March 1985, and Dr. Tedder answers, I think it's earlier than that. I mean, March 85 was the description of one of the young men who developed glandular fever-like illness. The individual who developed glandular fever-like illness was March 1984. And I had no suspicion that that was due to HTLV3 at the time, because we kept weekly samples on him, we were retrospectively able to discover that the horrendous clinical course this young man had was as a result of HTLV3 infection. But I had no idea. It never occurred to me because it hadn't been described. This I think was the first case, one of the first cases in the world that was described once testing became available. But in March 1984, we had this terrible clinical episode. We had no idea what was wrong with the patient. He'd had a simple, what appeared to be a simple synovectomy for a very, very troublesome knee joint that he'd had a lot of trouble with bleeds in. So your question is that I had no prior inkling that any of our patients had been infected.
If you didn't have any such prior inkling,
yes,
and you had a firm belief in the safety of the Scottish product, why had you taken the step in the first place of asking Dr. Tedder to use what we know from elsewhere were scarce resources to test samples of your patients?
Well, to be honest, I nearly didn't. I was pretty confident that they would be negative. There were, as we discussed yesterday, there were 2 or 3 patients, or a small number of patients, who had received commercial concentrates, and as much on the basis of testing those individuals that I sent the samples to Richard Tedder, but I nearly didn't send any samples at all. Had I not done that, then it wouldn't have been clear that this terrible episode of the batch of factor VIII had happened, and that potentially, as I was saying earlier, was one of the events that led to the meeting on the 10th of December. If one of the reasons was my discovery of these patients being positive, was for the meeting being called, then that was very fortunate, because the meeting had been delayed, or if I had not tested my patients and had still been the meeting, there might not have been a recommendation to heat treat NHS concentrates. So, and if the meeting had been delayed for other reasons, in other words, I hadn't made these observations, the meeting had been held in January or February, then that would have delayed the introduction of heat treatment and the benefits of that in the UK.
Professor, my question implied no criticism of having the samples tested. The question was why, given that you had, you say, no reason to suspect that there was anything untoward, why did you send 50 to 70 samples, was your estimate, to Penrose, to Dr. Tedder, the vast majority of whom had only been treated with NHS concentrates?
Oh, I sent them because Dr. Tedder and his colleagues had published a paper in the Lancet in, I think, September of that year, describing anti-HTLV3 testing of patients in different groups. And one of the groups was people with haemophilia, of which 34% were positive. Now, this was a research test for anti-HTLV3, and therefore had to be viewed with a certain degree of uncertainty about interpreting the results. But it also included 1,000 North London blood donors, none of whom were positive. So it was the availability of the test, the anti-HTLV3 test, that alerted me to it being available in the UK, and I thought, well, I should at least find out whether the patients who got commercial concentrate were antibody positive or not, and along the way, why not send some people who had only received Scottish factor VIII, as I say, expecting them to be negative. That was the reasoning, and there were only about 10 samples that sent to start with.
Want to look with you at the steps you took after receiving the results, and we've got the dates from that memo, 26th of October and then the 2nd of November for the further results. If we have up on screen, please, LOTH 5097_007, please, Seamus. If we go to page 3, please. So we can see this is headed Confidential Summary of a Meeting on the 7th of November 1984, subject Laboratory and Clinical Management of Patients with Evidence of HTLV3 infection and from groups known to be at risk. And there are a number of attendees from the GUM clinic, the diagnostic lab, etc., and you and a colleague, Dr. Parker, from haematology. If we look at the next paragraph down, sorry, if we just go up slightly, Seamus, thank you. Under the heading 1, it says, this new human retrovirus is now believed to be the etiological agent of AIDS. Virus is present in and can be transmitted by close contact with patients' blood, saliva, and probably other secretions similar to hepatitis B. The groups of patients known to be at risk are promiscuous male homosexuals and recipients of blood products, especially factor VIII concentrates. Antibody to HTLV3 can be measured and is present in the preclinical stages. And then this, it is important to appreciate that patients with antibody are infectious and can transmit the virus. And then we go on to see, if we look at the rest of the document, paragraph 2, general guidelines have been circulated for the management of AIDS patients and their specimens. They should be managed as for patients with hepatitis B. We can see under the heading Local Problems A, there's reference to a limited research study in 20 haemophiliac patients having antibody to HTLV3 associated with a particular batch of factor VIII concentrate. And then we can skip the next paragraph. If we go to the preceding page, Seamus, because this document appears out of order. And then if we zoom in on top of the page, proposals, says the following groups of patients must be treated as high risk. A, haemophiliac patients who are known to have antibody to HTLV3 and all other patients who have received factor VIII or 9 concentrates prepared from large numbers of donors. And then there's various discussions of implications. If we go further down, we can see at D, the top of what we can see on the screen, laboratories must be informed that specimens are from high-risk patients, processed according to established high-risk procedures. And then implications A, clinical management information must be given to surgeons and dentists or any others who may be required to examine or investigate the patient. And then there's a description about facilities, accidental exposure of staff and diagnostic service. If we then go back to page 3, please, Shomik. If we look again at that sentence, it is important to appreciate that patients with antibody are infectious and can transmit the virus. There doesn't appear to have been any great uncertainty or misunderstanding at this meeting as to the significance of a positive result, does there?
I think this is very interesting. I note the date of the meeting, and it, I think, has arisen because of the samples I sent to Dr. Tedder, because I think my patients were the first to be diagnosed with anti-HDLV3 in Edinburgh, and I found myself at the centre of very many things related to HDLV3 in the hospital and in the health service. The difficulties mounted up very quickly, and to try and address these, we got together a group of appropriate experts, and I was asked to chair the group on behalf of the health board, and we had frequent meetings dealing with a whole range of issues within the hospital, particularly in relation to managing patients from at-risk groups. We took a very cautious view about samples and about people, not only, as you see here, who were anti-HDLV3 positive, but we made the assumption that in relation to haemophilia, that anyone who had recently received clotting factor concentrate from whatever source, whether it was NHS or commercial, might be infected, because we had no idea what the false negative rate was for Professor Tedder's test. In other words, patients who might test negative on his test but might still be infected with the virus. So we adopted that approach. It had a number of advantages I'm happy to go into, if you would like, from the point of view of managing patients, and the advice that we gave to patients was irrespective of their anti-HDLV3 status.
The particular sentence I invited your attention to, Professor, was important to appreciate that patients with antibody are infectious and can transmit the virus. That was the understanding of this meeting, was it not?
Yes, that's fine. Yeah.
And because of that, although you then broadened it out for the reasons you've given to that the arrangements might cover, for example, all haemophilia patients who'd received concentrates, the implications were, amongst other things, all specimens to be treated as high risk, and surgeons, dentists, other clinicians would be told that they needed to implement high-risk operative procedures. But at this point, as at the 7th of November, no discussion here of any steps to tell the patients themselves.
That's correct. We were quite taken aback. I was quite taken aback by the results that I had received. And it was only on 5 or 6 patients. And this meeting almost certainly occurred because of my observations. As I say, we were taken aback and taking stock of the situation, and it, if you like, it was out the blue, and we had to actually think about what the implications were.
I think we've already established by reference to Dr. McClelland's note that it was the 2nd of November you were told it was a larger number than the 5 or 6, 16 patients. So by the time this meeting is occurring on the 7th of November, you already have the second suite of results.
I'm not in a position at the moment to quibble over the dates, but the first results were phoned to me on the 26th of October. I think, did Professor Tedder not say it was a Friday?
If we look at Dr. McClelland's memo, if we go back to that, PRSE 40828. We can see paragraph 1, Friday the 26th of October, that's the 6 results. And then there's further discussions that Dr. McClelland describes. And then there's a further phone call related in paragraph 3 between you and Dr. Bolton. And then paragraph 4, 2nd of November, Friday the 2nd of November, Dr. Ludlam telephoned me at home. He had that afternoon received further data from Dr. Richard Tedder relating to a total of 16 of his haemophilia patients. An initial look at these data indicated that either 15 or 16 of these patients had received the above batch.
Thank you. That's helpful. I hadn't retained that. So I must have sent some samples down to Dr. Tedder on Monday, the following after the whatever it would be, the end of 31st or no, the 30th of October, and he must have processed them fairly quickly and let me know the results.
If we just then, so we've looked at the meeting of the 7th of November. There's just 3 pieces of correspondence I want to look at from November, and then we'll turn to the meeting of the 19th of December, and that'll probably be where we get to for today. If we could look at, please, LOTH 5097_007. We can see on the 16th of November, you wrote to Dr. Sutherland, community medicine specialist. You've told him in the first paragraph that some patients have antibody to HDLV3 virus. You refer in the second paragraph to classification of haemophiliacs who've received concentrates at high risk. And then you say this in the third paragraph: we hope that at the clinical end of our service that this will not cause too much disruption, although it is going to be necessary to offer a reasonable explanation to some of the patients. And then you go on to talk about implications for the laboratory and refer to another meeting. What did you mean by it's going to be necessary to offer a reasonable explanation to some of our patients?
Well, explain the results, or that we had results if they wish to know them.
That still wasn't done as at the 16th of, or hadn't been done as at the 16th of November, had it?
No.
If we then look at there's a letter from the day before to LOTH 605_052, please. So my screen's gone blank, Shomik. If we go to the first page of that. Thank you. This is a letter from Dr. McClelland to Dr. Cash, 15th of November. It's CC'd to you. We can see, and I'm not proposing to go through the detail of all of it, but we can see from the first paragraph that there've been clearly a number of discussions between you and Dr. McClelland about the discovery of patients having been infected with HTLV3 due to PFC product. And we can see from further down this letter, there's been an analysis undertaken by you and Dr. Tedder, this is the third paragraph, suggesting one batch of product had been received by all but one of the 16 patients and was highly suspect. And then a description of there being a further analysis. This is the numbered paragraphs towards the bottom of the page. And then if we go over the page, we can see the conclusions, second half of the page. It is that a batch ending 090 is probably responsible for seroconversion. And there's a discussion about what to do with other batches. And then in the last paragraph, Dr. McClelland thanks you for your data analysis. And then it says this, Dr. Ludlam has specifically requested that the information relating to the batch associated with seroconversion be treated in confidence. Why did you want that information to be treated in confidence?
Because I wanted to inform the patients in a controlled way. I didn't want it the patients learning, if you like, by rumour that there were results available.
We can see that those discussions and that analysis that you and Dr. McClelland had undertaken must have been completed by the 15th of November. That's the date of the letter. We can then see you attended a meeting on the 29th of November. This is at PRSE 302066. We see the date at the top of the page. We see the attendees, which include you. We can see in paragraph 2, it's a meeting convened to discuss the implications of the recent finding of HTLV3 antibodies in Scottish haemophiliacs, measures being taken by SNBTS to prevent transmission of AIDS by blood products, and the media attention associated with these developments. And then there's a reference to the Elstree meeting that we know took place on the 10th of December. The third paragraph refers to you explaining the circumstances in which it's been discovered that 16 patients had developed antibodies to HTLV3. And then if we go over the page, please, there's a discussion about heat treatment that I'm not going to ask you about for present purposes. If we look at paragraph 8 towards the bottom of the page, views were exchanged on the very difficult ethical questions which had arisen. These included whether patients and patients' relatives should be informed and perhaps subjected to needless worry, whether publicity additional to that already provided should be given, and how directors should respond to direct inquiries or requests for advice. The chairman advised members that ministers had been informed, that the SIO had been briefed. While a press statement would not be issued by the department at present, any inquiries would be answered. It was agreed that every effort should be made for patients to have the situation explained to them before the impending publicity. So we can see that by the 29th of November then, Professor Ludlam, a number of organisations or individuals, including ministers, have been told of the situation. Patients at this stage are still in the dark, aren't they?
Yes.
Why was it a very difficult ethical problem to decide whether to tell a patient that they have antibodies to HTLV3?
At this time, I think because of there was a lot of activity, a lot of discussion, and I was waiting for the meeting on the 10th of December to happen to get the view of my colleagues and for a full discussion about the issues. We could have we could have informed patients sooner. We could have indicated to patients that results were available sooner. But we were considering actually how the best way was to manage the situation and to think what we should be saying to patients and what patients would want to know. This took us, I have to say, very much by surprise, as you will have gathered, and a lot of activity going on, and we needed to, as it were, get our minds in order and our systems, decide what our systems should be. So that's where we were. I didn't want information being spread by rumour, because that didn't help.
We look at one further letter from November, which is at HCDO 40-273_058, please. This is a letter from Dr. Krask to you on the 30th of November, and we can see from the first paragraph that you've had telephone conversations, plural, with Dr. Krask about the issue of suspect batches and infection. And if we go over the page, we look at the bottom half of the page under the heading Methods of Investigation. You can see there's a strategy there proposed by him: identify all patients and then follow them up for at least 4 monthly intervals for 6 years. At the top of the next page, there's a discussion about record forms JC1, JC2, JC3 to be completed and returned to Dr. Krask. And then if we go to the next page, we can see under the heading, if we go down a bit, sorry, Seamus, should the patient be told? The view of Dr. Krask, ideally, I think he should, but this will depend on many factors, including the amount of anxiety concerning AIDS already present in the centre and the degree to which the patient is capable of understanding the situation. Every effort should be made to encourage the patient to discuss the problem with his spouse and help them to face the problem together. The GP should also be informed by letter. What was it that had prompted you at a stage when, as I say, none of your patients yet knew the results, to contact Dr. Krask and have a series of conversations with him?
Could you go back to the top of the letter,
yes,
please?
The first page.
Yes,
yeah.
Please.
Top of the first page, please, Seamus.
I don't think I contacted Dr. Krask. I think he telephoned me, and we must have had a discussion, and he then wrote this letter and sent it to me. Interesting. Yes, no, that I think is the sequence of events.
Do you recall whether you completed the JC1, 2 and 3 forms for the patients, and if so, when?
I don't think we did, no. I don't remember doing. It's possible one of my staff did, but I don't have any recollection of that.
Now, we know from your and other evidence that eventually on the 19th of December of 1984, a group meeting took place at the Edinburgh Royal Infirmary. By that time, is this right, you had known the results for 16 patients, as well as a larger number of negative results, for nearly 2 months and had not told a single patient?
That's correct, yes.
Even though, as we saw from the meeting on the 7th of November, patients were known to be infectious, and this was a disease known to be sexually transmissible. Why the delay, Professor Ludlam?
I think the implications of it all were so enormous, actually, that it took us a bit of time for it all to sink in and for us to think of the best way of responding. And as you see, there were a series of meetings, and I was keen to gather as much wisdom and help and advice as I could, so that I could help the patients as I thought was best.
Did that delay not place at risk not only those who had in sexual relationships with the infected patients, but bearing in mind that we're talking about a cohort of severe haemophiliacs, family members or other contacts who might come into contact with their blood?
Well, as far as family members are concerned, they were all very aware of that the blood, any blood spillages potentially contained infectious viruses. That was well established, and we tried to persuade or arrange that patients treated themselves, and they knew about avoiding blood contact with other family members. So far as connection with possibility of sexual transmission, yes, there was a 2-month delay. The risk, we know actually the risk was very small, but it was a small risk, and looked at in retrospect, if I had sent out some information on the very early in November, we would have had a lot of patients who were suddenly on our doorstep wanting further information and distressed, and it might have been too much for us to cope with. The stress, it's easy looking back at with literally 20/20 vision, and although we knew there was a risk, if you like, from sexual transmission, we had no idea how great the risk was, though we thought it was relatively small, and it turned out to be vaginal intercourse anyway was a small risk. But it was a very difficult time, and certainly I do see that in retrospect maybe we should have done things differently, and we certainly learnt a huge amount from the way we responded to the whole of this episode in relation to AIDS. For example, when it came to considering issues related to new variant CJD, we took a different approach, and we had learned from the very stressful event surrounding HTLV3, and particularly as things rolled out the end of 1984 and into 1985.
Why did you organise a group meeting in a lecture theatre at the Royal Infirmary rather than invite 16 patients to come and see you confidentially and privately, one by one? Why did you think a group meeting was a good idea?
Well, I went to the meeting on the 10th of December in London at Elstree. It was a big meeting. We've discussed it. It was important. It was a stressful meeting, and I was keen to get other people's views. I turned up at work the following morning to receive a phone call from the Yorkshire Post. A reporter said he had heard about the Edinburgh episode. I think the implication, my memory is that as a result of the meeting the previous day, and he wished to publicise this in the Yorkshire Post the following day. And I was absolutely furious with him, that because this sort of publicity is not the way that patients should be informed about the situation, whether they're antibody positive or negative. And so he agreed to come up and see me. I think he came up perhaps the following day. And I begged him to delay. He was desperate to publish his story in case someone else, some other newspaper, published it first. And I was very upset and very cross. And I was left, he said, well, I really want to publish this. And so I eventually persuaded him to wait about a week before publishing it. He told me, okay, he would publish it on I think it was the 20th of December, which left me a handful of days to decide what to do. And there was no way that I could, my staff could see everyone. So the next best thing was to write to all the patients and say that we were holding a meeting about AIDS and HTLV3 on the evening of I think it was the 19th. If they like to come, we would tell them more. If they weren't able to come, that wish to discuss the situation to get in touch with me. That's how the meeting came to be held. It wasn't my idea of the way of informing patients about what had happened, but I was, as it were, doorstepped by the Yorkshire Post and what I think was not good behaviour.
If the threat of impending publication had not been made and precipitated the meeting in the way you describe, is it likely then that 1984 would have come to an end with your patients none the wiser?
I think I would have written to the patients saying results have become available. If they would like to know the results, please make an appointment to come and see me. And I would have, as you know, we sent out an information sheet. I would have sent that out or something similar to it to all patients. And then, as it were, monitored, as we did anyway, who responded, who came to see me, who would have come to see me. That's what I would have done had the Yorkshire Post not intervened.
Can we just look at the letter that was sent on the 12th of December 1984, WITN 3428009, please? This is your letter of the 12th of December to patients and parents. Much publicity in the press and television about HTLV3 virus and AIDS. Dr. Forbes and I are holding a meeting to discuss with patients some of the anxieties and issues that have been raised. You're cordially invited. We'll speak for a few minutes on AIDS, haemophilia and blood transfusion. We'll then open the meeting to questions and general discussion. If you don't wish or are unable to attend but would like to talk to me, we'll be delighted to see you by appointment. There's nothing in that letter, is there, that would inform the recipient that there is a problem with Scottish factor, or that patients have been tested, or that there are positive results that have come back?
No, but I opened the letter with saying there's been much publicity, so there was a lot around in the general news about AIDS, and so patients were aware of the virus. I agree. I didn't want at this stage to I suppose I could have. I suppose I could have said that we had results from some patients, but I didn't. But the implication was that if you were interested, please come and see me.
The problem with sending a letter in these terms, Professor Ludlam, although you may not have wanted to cause undue anxiety, is that the recipient might think, oh, this is just a meeting designed to reassure. The recipient who for years has received concentrate that they've been assured is Scottish and safe may think that there's no point in them attending this meeting. As your evidence to Penrose explained, that in fact you sent the invitation to every patient in Scotland, expected hundreds, and only a few tens turned up.
I'm sorry, can you repeat your question?
Yes, of course. Because this letter is written in the terms that we see on the screen, recipients of it might have simply thought this was a meeting designed to reassure, and that they weren't personally at risk because they'd received Safe Scottish Factor for years, and therefore there was no need for them to turn up.
That's really a comment, but it's framed with a question mark at the end.
It is.
Yeah. I assumed that people with haemophilia would have a fairly low threshold for being concerned about AIDS. And in a sense, I didn't need to say too much to encourage people. People would have a low threshold to attend the meeting. And as you see, that was my view. I'd set aside 2 large lecture theatres because I thought we'd sent this letter out to all people with haemophilia in Scotland, was my understanding, with Dr. Forbes and the other East Coast centres. There may have been some misunderstanding about that. Certainly it went out to all those in southeast Scotland.
And what is your recollection of what you said at that group meeting about the issue of testing and test results?
Oh, I explained that we had tested from stored samples in Richard Tedder's test, and that some of them had been reported as being positive, and that we had preliminary look at the results suggested that there'd been at least one batch of PFC concentrate that had caused infection.
And is this correct that after that meeting, you left it to patients to make contact with you or the centre to find out if if they'd been tested and what their test results were?
Well, we wrote to all patients and enclosed the information sheet that you have, which describes situation in relation to HGLV3, including the safety precautions, and there was the invitation in the covering letter to come and find out more by making an appointment, and that arrangement actually worked reasonably well for the majority of patients. They were appreciative, actually, of a bit of time to think about whether they wished to know their result or not. It was very interesting seeing patients in early 1985, and I used to see them mostly in my room in the haematology department rather than the outpatient clinic, medical outpatient clinic, because it was a quieter place, less likely to be disturbed. And I could see patients outside the clinic time. And patients really appreciated the opportunity just to reflect, to talk about themselves, because the implications of knowing that you were antibody positive led to another series of questions. And with the outside world not being very sympathetic, to put it mildly, to people with haemophilia, once it became common knowledge that a number were anti-HTLV3 positive, patients wanted, and their families wanted, a bit of time and before they came to see me.
Professor Ludlam, I may need to pick up with you tomorrow events in early 1985 and what you say patient reaction was. Before we do that, just two short matters arising out of the meeting or related to the meeting. You've exhibited to your witness statement the information sheet that you say was sent out after the 19th of December meeting, but not the letter which was sent to patients, which you say accompanied it and invited them to come and find out more. Is there a reason for that? Do you have a copy of the letter available to you?
I'm sorry, I don't have a copy. As you know, I have a fairly extensive archive related to all of this, which I have been very careful to preserve because of the severity of the episode and the catastrophic consequences of the episode. I'm sorry, I don't have a copy of the letter.
And then finally for today, if we just look at an observation you make about your approach in your witness statement, so it's WITN 3428001. If we go to page 100 and... No, I'm sorry, that's the wrong reference. Well, in that case, it may be more sensible that I pick it up in the morning with the correct reference.
Yes. Well, we'll take a break now. I'm sure you could do with one. But can I just, before we break, just pick up on a couple of points which arise out of this last exchange and some of the evidence which you gave earlier. You've told us how really stressful the time it was, having sent off your blood samples to Richard Tedder and having got back about the 26th of October at least 6 positive results, and then a few days later a total of 16. And you've essentially, I think, given a description of not quite knowing where to turn. Just trying to work out, come to terms with the situation. Am I right in that?
No, you are correct. Was very much taken aback.
So obviously you thought it was very, very serious indeed. Am I right?
Yes, that's correct.
At this time, you did not know, you told us, you drew a distinction between HIV, or HTLV3 as it was then, and AIDS. And you had a belief, indeed is what Krask told you on the 30th of November, that the chances of developing AIDS were somewhere between 1 in 100 and 1 in 500. But that still struck you as being very, very serious.
The seriousness was related to the fact that people appeared to have become infected. That was serious enough, if you like, and the consequences of that were, to some extent, unknown, and that is also unsettling.
Was it because they were not only, to some extent, unknown, but well appreciated, both by you and plainly by the popular press, if they were chasing the story, well appreciated that it might be very serious indeed, possibly deadly.
I think it was the uncertainty that was stressful. I entirely agree that if I had known what we subsequently learnt, that if you're antibody positive, the chance of getting AIDS was very high indeed. Yes, that would have been stressful, difficult, but at least that would have been, if you like, a known fact. What was so difficult this instance was trying to cope with the uncertainty. Was this actually a situation where 100% of those infected were going to get AIDS, or was it a case of only 1%? And trying to cope with that and explain to patients and ourselves that degree of uncertainty for a serious disorder was taxing. Is that?
Well, it is helpful to an extent. Yes, thank you very much. We'll take a break now, and it's 10 o'clock, of course, tomorrow morning, and I look forward to seeing you again then. Thank you very much. 10 o'clock tomorrow morning.